If Robbie Lawler was worried about the fallout of Keane Mulready-Woods' horrific murder, he wasn't showing it. As the Gardaí investigated and the media continued to report on the 17-year-old's death, Lawler simply decided to get out of Dodge. It must have felt like a good time to leave. His brother-in-law and close associate Richie Carberry was dead. His ex-partner Rachel Kerwin was obviously wary of him since the court case where she'd recanted her initial statement to the Gardaí. Even his own mother had admitted to Gardaí about being worried about his state of mind and what he might be capable of. And now everyone knew exactly how far he was prepared to go. Not only happy to brutally murder a child, but also to dismember his body and plant it in various places, with obvious clues about who was responsible. For a short time, Lawler possibly thought he was back on top, untouchable, everyone terrified of what he might do next. The guards were undoubtedly determined to get him this time, but no one would be willing to rat him out or help them. He'd made sure of that. But he wasn't totally stupid. He knew life in the short term would be difficult for him if he stayed where he was. Someone could very easily try and take the opportunity to get him back. And he was undoubtedly finding that doing business was getting trickier, with fewer people in Dublin and Louth willing to get involved with him. So rather than hang out where he definitely wasn't wanted, he decided to head towards the bright lights of Belfast, a place with its own booming drugs trade and where he could take the time to let things south of the border simmer down. And with the sounds of it, his migration north was encouraged and facilitated by new friends like Warren Crossen and his girlfriend. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're listening to Double Cross, the Murder of Robbie Lawlor, a Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal.
Tommy Crossen, when he was leader of the Continuity IRA, they were quite active at the time. They wouldn't really exist now. It's more turned into some sort of old boys club that march around Lurgan every Easter. But back at that time, they would have been quite big hitters. I was asked to go and collect a statement from the Continuity IRA. Well, first of all, I was put in a car and driven round and round in circles by this fella. And after about 10 minutes of driving in circles, I said to him, "Can I ask you what we're doing?" And he said, "Oh, I was told to take you the scenic route to Lose you." And I went, "Don't you know I'm from here? Like, I grew up about 2 streets from here. You could drive me around here all day long and you're not going to lose me, mate." At which point I thought their intelligence is excellent. But anyway, so we eventually just went, right, we'll give up on that idea. And I went to house and there are all these people sitting in the full paramilitary uniforms, the balaclava. And you know, we will go to prison to protect our sources, but given Tommy Crossen is no longer alive and no longer needs protected, Tommy Crossen, even with a balaclava on, was Tommy Crossen. He was a big man and very distinctive. So I'm pretending I don't know who he is. He's pretending that I don't know who he is, but everybody knows who he is. And at that stage, a guy with a mask on said to me, because they'd obviously the guns down in front of him, they were going to give me this statement. And he said, "Before we start, can I get you a cup of tea or coffee or a green tea?" A man in a balaclava just asked me, "Do I want green tea?" And I went, "No, can we get this over and done with before the cops kick the door in and we all get arrested?" And that was it. And I have told that to people who went, "That didn't happen. You couldn't have." And I went, "No, he very much did." After the father died, Warren Crossen took on a very sort of, man of the house type role around his mother's home. His father was given a full paramilitary funeral. You know, I covered that at the time. He was his coffin was brought out into the front of their house. It was placed on top of a stand and masked men came out and fired shots over the top of it. He was given the full paramilitary funeral. Warren Crossen would have only been in his early 20s at the time, 20 or 21 years of age. He had been involved in petty criminality. He wasn't considered a threat. But as time was going on, it was becoming more and more obvious that Warren Crossen was becoming a big player in the criminal underworld. He also had a second-hand car dealership, which is something that has become the business of choice for those who are laundering criminal assets. We find that quite a lot of those people who have been murdered of recently, their legitimate businesses, if you like, has been involved in the buying and selling of second-hand cars. Warren Crossen had a car sales business. But if you're a Republican paramilitary and Warren Crossen, who had already come under your radar because of his father, and the internal Republican infighting that was going on then was clearly hanging around with people who had guns and who were willing to murder people. Well, if you were maybe one of the Republican gangs who was responsible for murdering Tommy Crossen, would you think this boy's going to come seeking his revenge very soon? And not only that, he now has the ability to seek it. He's not some kid anymore. He's now someone with big connections.
It's hard to know if Robbie Lawlor really and truly believed all he had to do was bide his time before things settled down. He certainly made sure to enjoy himself in Belfast, while also getting stuck into establishing himself as a force to be reckoned with in his new city. By March 2020, he was living there full-time and had become adept at collecting drug debts from local dealers who owed cash to gangs across the border. So we do know there were lines of communication still open to him, and some were still happy to use his services. It's also known that he was happy to travel outside the city to go on jobs. I really feel for the small-time drug dealer in North Armagh who opened their door to a wild-eyed Robbie Lawlor demanding £16,000 for an original debt of just £2. As the world grappled with the dawning realisation that it was in the grips of the first global pandemic in more than a century, Lawler continued doing what he did best, threatening, intimidating and showing no mercy. But as we all know, blow-ins don't always get welcomed into established communities. And while Lawler may have thought his reputation as a hard man not to be crossed was spreading across the city, in fact, he was raising the hackles of local dealers who resented this murderous thug from the south coming up to their patch. It didn't help that he was a loud and unmissable presence on Belfast's social scene.
Our sort of, I suppose, equivalent of Temple Bar would be the Cathedral Quarter, and that's where all the bars and restaurants would be. It would be, I suppose, you know, do you use journalists speak when people write they go the trendy Cathedral Quarter? It's not that trendy. It is very...
Oh, I think it's so trendy.
But yeah, it's a few quid for a drink, just like a Temple Bar. But
yeah,
he'd been hanging around there. People had seen him there. He was telling people he was a car dealer. He was a bit of a womanizer, so he was loving the fact that there was a completely new set of females for him to flash around the place, because he wasn't particularly that well known here. His face wouldn't have been recognised instantly the way it would have been if he had been trying to socialise in places in Dublin or Drogheda or Dundalk or any place like that. So he was up here having the time of his life. The fact is that he had a few quid about him. He was letting on to be a car dealer. He was being very flash. He was spending a lot of money. And he was going for probably quite young women. He had absolutely no notion of who he was, his background. But if there's that sort of slight air of danger around him, we know there's certain people that are attracted to that anyway. And to him, it was probably like being in Disneyland, because he was in this place where he had easy access to an easy ability to make money, an easy ability to drugs, an easy ability to all the trappings of wealth, fancy restaurants, plenty of bars, and he wouldn't have been under the same scrutiny that he would have been with the guards in the south. He was able to more or less live in a life that was very different from what he had been living since his release from prison. But also then lockdown happens as well, and like everyone else, Robbie Lawlor was locked down in his apartment.
But none of that bothered Lawler. He was used to not being liked. As long as he was feared, that's all that mattered. Except that in the meantime, behind his back, an unholy alliance was forming to take care of him once and for all. One that would criss-cross the country from Sligo to Limerick, from Dublin to Louth, and right up to where he was, in Belfast. Those who he once thought of as friends, or at least protectors of sorts, all now willing to join forces with his enemies. People he had double-crossed, people whose friends or associates he'd murdered, people who resented his way of doing business and were angry at the public attention his actions had brought down on the underworld. And then there was those who just believed he'd crossed the line with his heinous slaughter of a 17-year-old boy. You might have noticed that the Northwest's most prolific drug dealer, Barry Young, was jailed for 11 years recently. The 38-year-old pleaded guilty to directing a crime gang. For more than 2 decades, he and his mob were a significant scourge on the people of Sligo. The Special Criminal Court heard how his lust for money and wanton criminality had caused much harm, much stress, much destruction to society and to families throughout their reckless nature. The investigation into his activities discovered at least 7 bank accounts and a bogus car recovery business to launder his dirty money. But as the adage goes, crime doesn't always pay. By the time Young was arrested at Dublin Airport in January 2022, where he was planning to flee to Spain, he was crippled with anxiety. In fact, he thanked the Gardaí for picking him up, confiding how he'd thought about killing himself on several occasions. The root of his anxiety was a serious one. He'd managed to rack up a major debt to another drug dealer, one which sources have confirmed to me is Mr. Big. But for a long time, Young was doing exceptionally well. His drug operations spanned across Sligo, Leitrim, Donegal, Galway and the southwest, with an international connection to Spain. He'd a fearsome reputation and a habit of employing, as Gardaí described them, complete head-the-balls to do his dirty work. He was also suspected of being a major supplier of drugs to Northern Ireland and into the heart of Ardoyne in Belfast. On the 16th of March 2020, as schools were closed down and pubs warned they'd have to shut up shop for a fortnight to try and tackle the growing numbers of COVID-19, a man called Adrian Holland travelled from his home in Ardoyne to the Sligo Park Hotel to meet Barry Young. This is when, police believe, the elaborate, complex plan to take care of ruthless Robbie Lawlor was officially set in motion. Now, we have to be careful here because a lot of this stuff is still before the courts in Northern Ireland. But what we can say from evidence already heard during a bail hearing is that on the 1st of April 2020, defence teams working for Holland believe that a 3-man assassination team went to the Belfast safe house where Robbie Lawlor was living. CCTV footage, they say, showed 2 of the men calling to the door of the flat above a Tesco on University Road in the south of the city. The other man, who had never seen or met Lawler before, they say hung back as he came to the door. He was just there to observe, the courts have been told. He was the one tasked with shooting him, the defence allege. 3 days later, Robbie Lawlor had an appointment to meet Adrian Ado Holland at his grandmother's house on Etna Drive in Ardoyne. It's been reported that Ado had a debt of close to €20,000 and that Lawler was the one chasing the payment, although he denies this. At about 11:40 a.m. that Saturday, a car carrying Lawler and several other associates pulled up in front of the house. Lawler was most probably completely clueless as he made his way up the short garden path. But given his history when he saw a man holding a gun burst through the front door, he must have instantly known what was happening. Lawler tried to make a run for it, but he was too late. As his associates scarpered, leaving him there as the lone target, he was shot several times in the head and the chest, and he died at the scene.
I actually heard it on the news. I heard the usual. I heard that a number of names of people who had been killed, and you're getting phone calls from people, and then eventually then it calms down to a certain degree, and then the information starts coming out that he had been shot, and it was confirmed then that it actually was him. That flies about fairly quickly. Scars are no different than any other organisation. The rumour mill starts. And obviously for me personally as an investigator, I'm disappointed because we will not get him into court. That's very unfortunate for the victims, obviously for Robbie Lawlor's family, but it's very sad for, the family of Keane Mulready-Woods, knowing that he will never be brought to justice. And that can be very, very difficult. And it's difficult for investigators too, because there's a certain level of disappointment because you're putting a lot of work into a case and then the person that is the main suspect is shot themselves. But it does happen, unfortunately, in a lot of cases.
The fact that this had happened here was almost unthinkable because this is a community that would have been reading about gangland violence in Dublin and further afield, but wouldn't have thought that Dublin gangland violence would have ever came to here. This place is not a stranger to violence, don't get me wrong. This was probably one of the places that was most hardest hit during the conflict in terms of deaths. It sits on an interface. There's a lot of people from here. As we're standing here, you can see that there's a plaque on that wall facing there, and that's someone who was murdered during the Troubles, and there's a plaque in their memory because that's where they were shot. So it's no stranger to violence, but it was a stranger to that kind of violence. It was a stranger to drug gangs. It was, this was violence. It was Troubles related and had long since gone. We were in, a post-peace process era, and this was gangland violence, which is something completely different.
As people in the north scratched their heads about why a drug dealer from the south was now lying dead in a Belfast morgue, news of Lawler's grisly demise began to spread like wildfire on social media. And it wasn't pretty. Videos of young fellas standing outside a house in Dublin, music blaring, crates and crates of beer at their feet, as they whooped and hollered in delight for the camera. Another one of a man holding a bottle of rum, just filming his outstretched arm as he gleefully declared, "What can I say, boys? 2 in the head and now he's dead." And then Cornelius Price, his sworn enemy, filmed carefully pouring a shot of Captain Morgan's rum into a glass as he bellows, "This is to Robbie Lawlor, boys. Rest in peace." Well, no, I won't say rest in peace. Needless to say, the footage went viral.
Oh, there was huge relief within the criminal community, certainly. People celebrating on social media, which is, extremely sad for, the deceased person's family, because they don't need to see that or shouldn't see it. But he had inflicted a lot of fear within communities. So, that's the way certain people will react to the demise of another person. They're delighted because he's gone, so he's not going to maybe carry out revenge for something that they may have done. He's a serious criminal who's out of the way, out of their hair, and they can get on with their business. That's the way they would view it.
It wasn't just on the streets of Dublin that people were celebrating. There were reports of equally joyous scenes in the days after the shooting at Mountjoy Prison, where Limerick mobsters Wayne Dundon and his brother Desi and John were serving time together. They've been cheering and celebrating the murder since Saturday, a prison source revealed at the time. They're walking around now with their chests out. Given Robbie Lawlor's long and violent history, perhaps it's not surprising there was such an outpouring of joy at his death. In life, he showed little mercy to his own victims and built a career on being willing to take anyone out if the price was right. In his dealings with Fiona Mitchell and her son Derek, he stunningly revealed his psychotic side, targeting the mother of a man who dared to date his ex-partner and be kind to his children. It's true there were a few who would mourn his death, but perhaps we should take a beat and remember those who did grieve for him, including his 3 young children and those who turned up to his very small funeral on the 16th of April 2020. Due to COVID restrictions, just 15 people were allowed into the Sacred Heart Church in Laytown in County Meath, while another 10 stood outside. It might have been a small crowd, but the guards were taking no chances, and clearly visible at the church that day were 6 members of the Armed Support Unit, 2 detective cars, 3 uniformed Gardaí, a Garda van and 2 cars. Considering the ostentatious gangster funerals that have become all the rage in recent years, Lawler's was decidedly toned down. Just a large wreath of flowers spelling brother was displayed in the hearse that carried his coffin to the Dardistown Cemetery, where one of Ireland's most feared killers was laid to rest. It was a strangely muted end for one of the most chaotic and malevolent characters in Irish crime history. But while Lawler's reign of terror was over, the investigation into who was behind his killing was just beginning. On the day he was shot, PSNI officers arrested and held for questioning 2 men, aged 30 and 33, and a 17-year-old boy who were in a car on their way to the border. A few days later, all 3 were released, unconditionally for the teenager. Their identities, however, when they were finally and fully revealed, would send shockwaves through the Irish crime world. You've been listening to Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawlor. This podcast is produced by Nicola Tallant and Ian Malini for Crime World Presents. Claude Amini and Alison Morris are assistant producers. The script is by Jane Finnegan. Graphics are by Enda Bulger. This podcast is based on the book Web of Betrayal by me, Nicola Tallant. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.